Chapter 1. Fuxi, the first leader, innovator, and creator of ancient traditions. People in China often say that we have a history spanning 5,000 years and land stretching 90,000 miles. Someone once asked me, is China's history really 5,000 years long? But does that really matter? It reminds me of a funny story, more like a joke. A group of tourists were visiting a museum and saw a dinosaur skeleton. One of them asked the museum guide, "How old is this dinosaur?" The guide replied, "It's 60 million and 20 years old." The tourist was shocked. "How did you calculate that so exactly?" The guide said, "Oh, when I started working here, it was 60 million years old, and I've been here for 20 years, so now it's 60 million and 20 years old." So you see, sometimes these numbers don't really matter much. But since we've always talked about China having a long history of 5,000 years, we just keep saying it. So, when does this 5,000-year history start? Well, to explain that, we have to go way back. The start of almost every history story is like, long, long ago. One theory is that China's history begins with the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors. There's not much debate about the 5 emperors. We'll talk about them later. But who are the 3 sovereigns? There are 2 different opinions. One group says they were Suiren, Fuxi, and Shennong. Another group says they were Fuxi, Nuwa, and Shennong. So, which one is correct? Personally, I agree more with the second group, Fuxi, Nuwa, and Shennong. There are just more stories about them. Suiren taught people how to make fire by rubbing sticks together, which helped us go from eating raw food to cooked food. But his contribution doesn't seem quite as significant as the others. Fuxi, Nuwa, and Shennong, though, these 3 did much bigger things. Let's start with Fuxi. He's considered the leader of the 3 sovereigns, a wise man. And, like many ancient figures, his birth was said to be accompanied by some kind of miracle, but it was so long ago, around 9,000 years ago. Back then, in a faraway place, there was a land of peace and happiness called the land of Huaxu. Where exactly was this land? Sorry, I don't know. No matter how you try, whether by train, plane, or walking, you just can't get there. But just know that it was a beautiful, rich place where people lived long, happy lives. You might think, that's impossible. Didn't you just say ancient people didn't live long? If you're taking this too seriously, you're missing the point. This is ancient mythology. In that place, people lived long lives because they had fewer desires. Less desire, longer life. It's said humans could live to be 160 years old. Honestly, it's probably a good thing we don't live that long. The world might fall apart. Anyway, you're supposed to live 160 years, but why do most people pass away at 80? And 80 is considered a long life. Why? Because we have so many desires. Greed, anger, and all sorts of desires wear us down. You get mad in traffic, boom, you lose an hour of life. You can't light a cigarette, boom, there goes 5 more minutes. Smoke 20 packs a day, that's 100 minutes off. And so, little by little, we end up with 60, 70, maybe 80 years. But back then, people had no such desires. They worked when the sun rose and rested when it set. They didn't worry about much, and life was good. In this tribe, there was a leader, a beautiful young woman. You see, back then, it was the time of matriarchal clans, where women were in charge, and leadership passed down through the female bloodline. This woman, let's call her Huaxu, went out one day to explore a place called Liza, deep in the mountains. When she got there, she saw a giant footprint. How big was it? Well, if we're talking modern shoe sizes, it would be like size 5 and 40. Huaxu found it amusing. Who could have such a huge foot? So, out of curiosity, she stepped into the footprint. And guess what? She got pregnant. You might ask, how did that happen? Well, you'd have to ask Jesus' mom, because these kinds of things are common in ancient stories. It's not like in that joke where someone says, "God, the queen is pregnant. Who did it?" And then they actually figure out who did it. In these ancient legends, nobody really knows who's responsible. Like the Virgin Mary, who became pregnant without any man being involved, it's called a miracle. Otherwise, how could they give birth to a saint? It wasn't a normal human birth. It was something divine. And when the child was born, he had a human head and a snake's body. He grew fast, like the wind, kind of like Nezha from Chinese legends. That's why when you look at ancient drawings, whether on silk or stone, Fuxi is often shown with a human head and a snake's body. The god of Liza was the thunder god, which suggests Fuxi was the thunder god's son. Born with such strange signs, it was clear he wasn't ordinary. This is what we call ancient legend. Now, I know some of you are laughing, thinking, come on, this is nonsense. To be honest, I don't believe it either. Really, I don't. But here's the thing. Ancient legends aren't just random stories or superstitions. They were the way people back then made sense of the world. They didn't understand things like sound, light, electricity, physics, chemistry, history, politics, or military strategies. This was how they explained the world, and these stories were passed down through generations. But if we look beyond the layers of myth, we can uncover some truths. What truths, you ask? Well, for starters, we know Fuxi's mother was Huashu, but who was his father? That's a mystery. Why make up a story about stepping in a footprint and getting pregnant? Maybe because his mother didn't know who the father was. You might say, that sounds messy. By today's standards, maybe. But back then, in the time of matriarchal clans, there was no one-man, one-woman marriage. It was a time of free relationships, and there wasn't a clear sense of family lineage like we have now. Back then, a man would visit a woman's tribe, and in modern terms, let's just say they had a brief relationship. Afterward, the man's role was done, and he left. So when a child was born, they didn't know who the father was. That's why, if we peel back the layers of legend, we can see that Fuxi's mother was definitely Huaxu, but his father was probably a young man from the Lize tribe, maybe even its leader. At least, that's a reasonable guess. Now, picture the scene. It's a sunny morning in a beautiful grassy place called Lize. A young girl named Huaxu meets a handsome young man from the Lize tribe. They're said to be descendants of Suiren, but who knows for sure? Anyway, the young girl is drawn to the young man, and of course, he likes her too. So they wander into the woods and, well, what happens happens. A while later, Fuxi is born. So, while Fuxi's father's identity isn't clear, we know his mother was Huaxu. And since Fuxi was the son of a tribal leader, he was highly valued and got a good education. What kind of education? Well, we don't really know, but he probably learned all sorts of skills from the Suiren tribe. When his mother passed away, Fuxi became the leader of the tribe. Just keep in mind, in a matriarchal clan, the leader didn't always have to be a woman. The term matriarchal refers to the bloodline, which was passed down through the mother. Fuxi inherited his mother's position. He couldn't inherit anything from his father, because nobody knew who the father was. And so Fuxi became the leader of the tribe. After Fuxi became the leader of the tribe, he really showed that he wasn't just any ordinary leader. He had a heart full of compassion, always thinking about the struggles of his people. Life back then was really tough. People mostly relied on fishing and hunting, but it was far from easy. At that time, there were no fishing nets, just spears, and catching fish with a spear wasn't exactly efficient. You could hardly catch anything useful, and even if you did manage to spear a small fish, it wasn't enough to feed a person. As for hunting, that was even more dangerous. They only had stone tools, and while they were sharp, they weren't exactly high-tech. If you went after a deer, it could outrun you. If you chased a rabbit, it could outmaneuver you. And if you came across a rhino, an elephant, or a tiger, well, it's likely you wouldn't be coming home. The tiger would be way more excited to see you than you were to see it. It'd probably think, great, dinner's here, and that would be the end of you. Elephants, they'd just stomp you flat. With life so hard, Fuxi felt for his people. He wondered, what's the secret to the universe? How can I help my people live better lives? So, he sat on Mount Guatai, gazing at the mountains opposite him, deep in thought. Then one day, something incredible happened. The mountain split open and a heavenly horse flew out, shining brightly. It flew into the sky and then landed on a stone in the middle of the river. This horse glowed and revealed a 3D image of the Taiji symbol, the black and white yin-yang design. In that moment, everything became clear to Fuxi. He realized that the universe was all about the balance of yin and yang. The Taiji symbol spun in front of him, and he saw that all things could be understood through this balance. From there, he developed the 8 trigrams, a solid line to represent Qian, a broken line for Kun, and so on, creating a system that helped explain how everything in the world worked. This supposedly happened around 77-74 BCE, but don't ask me how they came up with that date. If you want to say 77-73 BCE, that's fine too. It's all part of the mystery. With this new understanding, Fuxi led his people forward. Now, Fuxi wasn't just wise. He was also quite popular. As he reached the age to marry, there was no need for matchmakers. Beautiful women danced around his house, hoping he'd choose them. The popular song of the day probably went something like, "Marry someone like Fuxi." It was hard for him to choose, but in the end, he picked one girl. And we all know her, Nuwa. She was 15 years younger than him, a real May-December romance. The two got married and lived happily together. But it wasn't just about the two of them. As the leader of the tribe, Fuxi knew they had to help the whole tribe thrive. Nuwa, as the first lady of the tribe, was also committed to helping their people grow and prosper. First, Fuxi thought about how hard it was for his brothers and tribespeople to catch fish and animals. If only there was a tool that could make it easier, he mused. One day, as he was deep in thought, he noticed a spider's web. "Ah, that's it," he thought. He saw how insects got trapped in the web, and it gave him the idea to create a net for fishing and hunting. A simple net could catch all sorts of creatures, from fish to rabbits, in one swoop. Thanks to him, the people learned to fish and hunt more efficiently. Even today, fishermen and hunters in China still see Fuxi as their patron saint, much like scholars honor Confucius or martial artists honor Guan Yu. After coming up with that innovation, Fuxi talked with Nuwa. "Look," he said, "we're living happily together now, but wouldn't it be great if all the men and women in the world could be as happy as we are?" Nuwa agreed wholeheartedly. Fuxi continued, "I've been thinking, maybe we should put some rules in place for marriage. People shouldn't just marry whoever they want. For example, a nephew shouldn't marry his aunt, and a niece shouldn't marry her uncle. It would be better if marriages followed bloodlines and family ranks." He also thought there should be a little more structure to marriage. Men should offer a gift when they marry, he suggested. 2 deerskins should be enough. That's actually how Fuxi married Nuwa, by giving her 2 deerskins as a bride price. So when exactly did Fuxi establish the marriage customs where the man had to offer a bride price to the woman's family? Well, it all started after people began using nets for fishing and hunting. Once they caught more animals than they could eat, they faced a new problem. In the past, food was always scarce, so whenever they caught something, they'd quickly clean it and eat it right away. But now, with an abundance of animals, what could they do with the extras? They couldn't store the meat. There were no refrigerators back then, so if they killed too many, the meat would spoil. That's when people started keeping the extra animals alive. They realized they could raise them instead of hunting them. Over time, these wild animals became domesticated, and this is how the practice of animal husbandry began. So, in addition to his other achievements, Fuxi is also seen as the founding father of animal farming. It's also said that Fuxi invented written language. Today, the earliest known Chinese characters are found in oracle bone script, which was already quite advanced. It included the 6 principles of Chinese writing: pictographs, ideographs, compound ideographs, phonetic loan characters, associative compounds, and derivative cognates. This means oracle bone script was a well-developed system of writing. But writing doesn't just appear fully formed, it evolves. Archaeologists have found early symbols on ancient pottery that look like a mix between pictures and characters, possibly representing the beginnings of Chinese writing. These symbols can't be deciphered yet, but they might be the roots of ancient Chinese script. These early symbols date back 7,000 to 8,000 years, which coincides with Fuxi's time. His contributions, from creating marriage customs to domesticating animals, and perhaps even developing early forms of writing, made him a pivotal figure in Chinese history. That's why he's honored as one of the founders of Chinese civilization. Now, was Fuxi the only one responsible for all these achievements? Of course not. But over time, people credited these milestones to him, and he became a symbol of that era. Fuxi lived to be 68 years old, dedicating his entire life to improving the lives of his people. After he passed away, the tribe chose his wife, Nuwa, to become the new leader. And Nuwa's story? Well, it's even more exciting than her husband's.